Euratom, cooperation over atomic energy, small thing, quite important, and then the European Economic Community, the EEC. I would argue that one of the important things also to realize about European economic integration was the only thing left. Actually, it tried lots of the rest, and it hadn't worked. It had to work. Remember, we had this grand vision, vicious fights every 30 or 40 years. We had to find something that worked. The rest, in some sense, is history. Andre is the great expert on this, and I'm not going to talk very much about it. We have deepening in terms of the Maastricht Treaty, the Lisbon Treaty, creation of the Eurozone. We have widening out the European Union from 6 to 27 members. But essentially, the vision was that from 1951, and that, in a sense, is what has carried us through and I think defined the enterprise. Let me talk also then about the institutions, and I'm actually going to make pretty much the same point about the institutions. The set of institutions that we have, with the exception of the central bank, are pretty much as they were designed for the European coal and steel community. The first of the institutions, the Commission, it proposes policy, it executes policy, but doesn't strictly make policy. It's explicitly supranational, and it's explicitly charged with the European ideal of keeping that process going, making it work. A group of people who get up every morning and think only about European integration. Quite different from the Council of Ministers, as Andre pointed out, a member-driven organisation. Here are a bunch of guys who think mostly about getting re-elected, but sometimes they think about European integration. But essentially their focus is not primarily on, as it were, the European project. The Council decides on policy. It decides now with a qualified majority. That qualified majority is going to change under the Lisbon Treaty in a few years' time. But at least for a good part of its history, basically every member had a veto if it was prepared to sort of exercise the political clout. It was a very much a sort of intergovernmental, very sensitive sort of process, but it very much was about compromising national interests, not about creating the whole. The Court of Justice, very interesting institution, created under the coal and steel community to interpret the law and make sure that it was applied. In those days, early 50s, I mean, it was a sort of branch of international law, but now has become something else. Exactly as Luke said, we're not quite sure what it is, but it's not international law anymore. It's something much more domestic, a whole series of sort of conventions, and it looks a bit more like a national justice system. It's a very, very influential organisation. It's an organisation, the organisation, that can tell the national governments what to do, and by and large they do it. It's clearly a very, very important part of the European process. Finally, the Parliament, still relatively uninfluential, growing influence, but it has some particular roles. Now, so those are the sort of four institutions. The balance is changing gradually over time, but the interesting thing is basically all from 1951. Now, coming from 1951, I think has given it two other features which some of us complain about a bit, and certainly is, I think, part of the European flavour, and again is not necessarily something that any other group is going to replicate, at least in the current circumstances. And that's its sort of bureaucratic background. The continental European tradition was of a fairly strong, elitist civil service with usually not too much political control. It was very much a civil service that was held to know best. After the Second World War, the government ran just about everything. And we were building these institutions in a period just after the Second World War where the presumption was that you had to have governments planning more or less everything. And all of that got built into this European model that made it both bureaucratic in the sense of a desire to design things right down to the last dot and comma, and also in the sense of capacity and almost an expectation that it had the right to do that. And while many of us complain about the bureaucracy, about the lack of legitimacy and so on, again, it's really important to remember where this thing came from. It came from the ashes of a century of fighting, a particular political and cultural history, and that gives it its unique flavour. European integration is 2 steps forward, 1 step back, sometimes the other way around, a sort of fitful process. The Commission, throughout this process, however, are the sort of the guardians of the vision. So go back to 1982, the Economist magazine has on its front cover a tombstone, EEC, RIP, rest in peace. It's all over in Europe. The politicians didn't really care. They were busy putting up non-tariff barriers against each other, against the rest of the world, and so on. They were dug in and not focusing on Europe at all. But the Commission, its job was to focus. Its jobs depended on its focus. And it came up with a surprisingly innovative and imaginative idea, and that was the single market. And that's the sort of example, I'm going to talk about that a bit more, but exactly the example of having an institution whose job it is to make this thing work is quite different from it's quite different from anything that's intergovernmental, and quite different really from almost anything else we see in the world. Andre has mentioned transfers. An important part of making the European compromise work, or the horse trading that goes on in the Council, is that there's a certain amount of transfers. These transfers are tiny compared with those within unitary states, but they're large by international standards. They're the largest transfers you see between countries, if that's the way you want to think about Europe. And it's difficult to know, but my guess is that's an important part of getting the sort of political compromise. It started off not very important because Europe was homogeneous, but even with the first enlargement to include Britain, Ireland and Denmark, it became plain that one was going to have some sort of transfers, some sort of policy that shared out the benefits a little bit differently from the way the original 6 had done it. So before I come back onto the policies, I just want to talk about one other feature which I think is sort of hardwired into the European experience, and that's what I've called the balance of power. Compared with almost every other bloc in the world, Europe is remarkably evenly balanced, with 2, France and Germany to start with, perhaps 3 with the UK, perhaps 4 with Italy, powers of more or less equal size. This is a table, there's another one which deals with some other blocs, which looks at the EEC as it started, EU27, NAFTA, Mercosur, CARICOM in this case. It asks what's the largest national share. I confess on the plane I think I've probably got combined Germany in there rather than just West Germany, so that's not quite appropriate in the very top maximum. It then looks at the ratio of the share of GDP of the largest power to the second power, is the countervailing power. It looks at the ratio of the share of the largest power to the smallest power, the max over the min, and then just to characterize the dispersion over all the membership, the standard deviation. Look at this table, and within this table, Europe looks absolutely unique, absolutely unique. The largest share, relatively small. The ratio of the shares of the first and the second powers, fairly evenly matched, the standard deviation lower. What is interesting is this fourth column that shows that Europe has a wider range of absolute sizes than any of the other blocs actually that I picked up. Absolutely massive. Germany to Luxembourg in 1957, Germany to Malta now, a factor of 450. So it's not that Europe hasn't got lots of small players, but at the top in terms of the politics, it's got some even balance. These are blocks from Africa. There are some African blocks that look a little bit more like the European model, UMOA, the EAC, but none of them have the same degree of balance at the top. And basically, among the others, again, also these very large top shares. Now, that, I think, is also another important feature with the history for explaining the way Europe works and what we've got. So the question, in a sense, then, I suppose I've rather said as I've gone along, do these institutions generalize? And the answer is, on the whole, they don't generalize very well.